don't know who the author of Hebrews is specifically. Traditionally, it's in ancient times, in the early church, it was assigned to the Apostle Paul. But the reason we don't know, the reason we're doubtful, is because the author does not name himself. So we're just not sure. But it's in the Bible, and it sounds a lot like Paul. It might be him, but he does. Whoever it is, they didn't name themselves. But anyway, there's a lot of good thoughts here. And let me begin reading in verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 10. It says, "For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of those things, can never with those sacrifices, which they offered year by year continually, make the comers thereunto perfect. For then would they not have ceased to be offered, because the worshippers, once purged, should have no more conscience of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a remembrance again made for sins every year. For it's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. Wherefore when he, meaning Jesus, when he cometh into the world, he saith, Sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body thou hast prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast had no pleasure. Then said I, Lo, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me, to do thy will, O God. Above when he said, Sacrifice and offering and burnt offering for sin thou wouldest not, neither hast pleasure therein, which are offered by the law. Then said he, Lo, I come to do thy will. He taketh away the first, that he may establish the second. By the which will, that is to say, when he came to do his will, by the which will we are sanctified, through the offering of the body of Jesus once for all. For every priest standeth daily ministering and offering oftentimes the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sin, sat down, one sacrifice of sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God, henceforth expecting till his enemies be made his footstool. For by one offering he hath perfected forever them that are sanctified." Now this is a great passage, and I only really meant to read you the first couple of verses, but it's so good I just hated to stop. But a lot of good thoughts here, talking about Jesus. And the main thought I wanted to get at today is back in verse 1. It said, "For the law having a shadow of good things to come." Now specifically in this passage he's talking about the sacrifices that are offered by the law. And he said about those sacrifices, the offering of the blood of bulls and goats, he said, it's not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And it also says, we read in verse 6, it said, in burnt offerings and sacrifice for sin, thou hast had no pleasure, meaning God. That he didn't take any pleasure in those offerings. And it always strikes me when I read this passage how interesting that is, because they weren't offering those offerings just because they took a whim one day and said, let's all just offer some sacrifices of some bulls and goats. They did it because God commanded them to do it, because it was written in the law to do it. And it's an interesting sort of a paradox in a way. Why would God command them to do something that he took no pleasure in? And why would he command them to do something, which it says in verse 1, it was only, well, that's the answer, it was a shadow of good things to come. When he commanded them to offer those bulls and goats and make an offering for sin, it was, and took no pleasure in it, it wasn't because the blood of those bulls and goats ever accomplished the taking away of sin, but they foreshadowed, or they presented an image, or they gave a picture that a sacrifice was to come. Something better was to come. A sacrifice would be made in the future that would actually take away sins forever. And he also says, I think it's interesting in verse 2, it says, "For would they not have ceased to be offered?" In fact, in other words, if they did what they were supposed to do, they could have done it once and been done with it. But it says they're offered again and again. The worshippers once purged should have no more offering conscience of sins. But verse 3 says, in those sacrifices there's a remembrance again made. Anything that is done over and over again, it creates a remembrance. And he's saying, if those sacrifices would have taken away sins, they would have quit making them, because by offering them again and again, what it actually was, rather than taking sins away, it was just a reminder that the sins were not taken away, because they offered them over and over again. And it was a picture of a sacrifice that was to come once and for all that would take away sins. It reminded me when I was reading this morning of things that we do again and again. For instance, the Lord's Supper. Last week, I believe it was, or was it the week before? I'm sorry, my memory, I should write it down, but we received the Lord's Supper recently. And we're instructed to do that. It doesn't say how often, but as often as you would, and we do it on a regular basis. But why do we do it? It's a remembrance. It calls to remembrance. And what does it call to remembrance? It calls to remembrance that Jesus shed His blood once for all for us. And we remind ourselves of that. There's been a sacrifice made for me, and it's Jesus. And at the Last Supper He said, "This cup is my blood of the New Testament, shed for you for the remission, the discharge from the penalty of your sins." And we receive the communion as often as we want to. You know, I've read about people like the great preacher Smith Wigglesworth. He used to get up every morning and take communion by himself. No matter where he was, no matter what he was doing, he would just get up and start the day by himself privately, take communion, just to remind himself of the whole basis of his relationship with God, which is not something that he did, but something Jesus did for him. And I think it's good to remind ourselves of that. But here's the thought I wanted to get at. Back in verse 1 again. It says, "For the law having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things." You know what a shadow is? Have you ever considered what a shadow is? A shadow is something that is created because there is a reality. And there's light shining on a reality. And when light shines on something that's real, it casts a shadow. But the shadow is not the real thing. It's an image or a representation, but it means there is something real. For instance, if you were standing on the street corner and you looked around at the corner and you saw a shadow coming, you would say to yourself, you don't say to yourself, "Here comes a shadow," you say, "Here comes somebody." And the shadow tells you that there's some real person coming. It's a little bit like this. It says, the law having a shadow of good things to come, not the very image of the things. An image is not the real thing. It's just a representation. It's sort of like the pictures that you carry in your wallet. They are images of your loved ones. You know, and you sometimes, I've seen, like, you ever watch war movies, you know, where the guys are in the foxhole and in the trenches, you know, and the bombs are falling around. They get their pictures out of their wallets and they're looking at their wives and talking about, you know, things like that. And, well, you see, the reason they do that, and the reason those pictures are precious, is because they're separated. Because they're not with the one that the image is of. And so they're precious then. But you know, when that soldier leaves and the war is over and he goes home and he's reunited with his wife, he doesn't then, sitting there with his wife, just a minute, I need to look at this picture in my wallet for a while. The picture in the wallet is not so important anymore when the reality is there. You see what I'm saying? And that's a little bit the reason that this writer is writing this. To remind us and to remind, especially, you know, it's called Hebrews for a reason. And we were praying this morning for the peace of Jerusalem. It was writing to Hebrews, who were people who had been Jews and then became Christians. But there was always a temptation to go back to what he says here is the shadow. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that we have a reality that the shadow conveys or portrays. And what I wanted to look at for a moment is some of the ways that the reality that's found in Jesus is conveyed to us by the foreshadowing. Before I do, let me read you another verse that says pretty much the same thing. It's in Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 16. Colossians chapter 2, beginning with verse 16. Now this one is the Apostle Paul. And he's saying almost the same thing, so maybe that's a clue. Maybe that was the Apostle Paul back in Hebrews. Lots of theories about Hebrew. It's interesting when you start reading everybody's ideas about things. But anyway, Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, it says, "Let no man therefore judge you." The word judge you there means to criticize you or condemn you or find fault with you. "Let no man judge you in meat or in drink or respect of a holy day," or literally the feast days. There were feast days commanded in the Old Testament. They were supposed to observe certain feasts. Like Passover, for instance. Passover was a command. You were supposed to go, every male was supposed to present himself in Jerusalem 3 times a year. Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And I think we can maybe, as an example of what I'm talking about, we can sort of see that those symbolize some realities that are later to come.